I had somebody write to me a few months ago and ask me whether or not they could do the radius rod bushings on their bus. They had a 4106 also, and people are constantly writing to me about questions about whether or not they can do things and how to do them. And so I told the person that asked me that question, I said, yeah, there's nothing technical about it, but it's very heavy duty work and you got to have big tools. So I was on a trip, a month-long trip to Colorado, about 4,000 miles, and I was pulling my Jeep and I made a sort of a swift turn from a right-hand curve to a left-hand curve, and I noticed the bus was not really handling right, and it felt like the back end was fishtailing, and I was able to get it under control, but it actually really bothered me. We went on with the trip, but the more I drove the bus, the more I realized I was having problems keeping it running in a straight line, especially in the wind, and when trucks and other things would pass me, or when we were on curves in the road, you were constantly having to oversteer to keep it going in a straight line. So I decided it was time to do radius rod bushings, and I'm glad I did. I'm doing all 8 rods, 4 in the back and 4 in the front, and 16 bushings. So here are some of the bushings that I've taken out, and the mess that you create when you do a job like this. You know, you do have to have big tools to do this because it has a lot of 3/4 inch bolts and, you know, heavy duty stuff, so it's not easy. So to get the bushings out, you know, here's an old one that was in there, and they get kind of hard after a while. They're hard to begin with, but they get a little rigid because they get compressed. Anyway, to get them off, the easiest way to do that is to take a screwdriver and shove it down in here, and then tilt it and hammer it in the rest of the way, and then you can simply pry the bushing out, and they'll pop right out. You can do that in less than 30 seconds. And then I'll show you the easiest way to get them in, back in. Sometimes I used to, you know, take a new one and put it on there, you know, put a new one on and then beat it on with a piece of 2x4 and a hammer, which is hard work and difficult, but I'll show you the way I found is the easiest way to get them in here in just a second. How to put these bushings in, the easiest way I found to do this. This is just simply a piece of all thread. I use this all thread for all kinds of things, putting in wheel bearings, seals, races, all kinds of things where you just want to pull something together or push it apart. And it really is an easy way to do this. You simply put the thread through and you draw, kind of like drawing on one side until you can't go anymore, and then you switch and go to the other side. Remember, no lubrication whatsoever on this. It's just dry. With the new paint on there, you know, it actually gives it a semi-smooth surface to pull in through, and once it gets in there, it's actually you can turn it and move it around and do different things with it, but get it aligned. Anyway, so you go quite a ways. It won't go evenly to start out with. You, as you can see, once you get it pretty tight on one side, you switch and go to the other side and kind of finish the job. The last segment of this, you sort of just pop the thing in by tapping it on something smooth. You don't want to pinch it though. You don't want to get it so that it's caught here and it begins to really damage the rubber. Alright, so that should be good for that side. For a minute, we'll readjust.
flip it over and get another section of it. My garage is too narrow to have a workbench in next to the bus, so I find myself working on the ground a lot like this. This is just an old mud flap I found on the side of the road that I use to do all kinds of things with. Alright, now we kind of have it almost to where we want it. And there won't be room for it to go all the way in because the plate, which by the way, these plates that I'm using are just the retaining plates for the bushings. They're older ones that I have here that I took off that make this job, make it are perfect for this job is what I'm trying to say. So the next step is don't do this on concrete, do it on something that's padded. So you can see where it is right now, almost to being in. And one hit like that on the ground and it's in. And they're loose like this to start out with, but when you tighten them up in there, they won't be loose anymore. You'll see that they'll deflect and completely fill this opening in here. So that's it. That's how you do it. The easiest, most civilized way that I've found to do that. Points to make about this. First off, when you're putting the bushings in the rods, you put them in the rods, by the way, while the rods are out. You don't use any lube of any kind or even water. They're to be installed dry, and I'll show you how to do that in a few minutes here. Use never seize on all the bolts because these things get bound up in here with rust. And if you don't put never seize in here, when you draw them in, they will seize up and they will be really, really hard to get out. In fact, I have one right now in the front that I haven't been able to get out and I'm still working on. The other thing is that I bought some new bolts, and these are actually too long. I like to find the smaller ones, but now the Fastenal doesn't have bolts, and it's really hard to find. These are grade 8 SIE gold bolts, so you may need to make sure that you get something that's rust resistant, that's hard like a grade 8. Don't use anything less than that, and you use the nuts and bolts that are fine thread. I used, actually back here was where my problem was. Somewhere along the way I had a bolt that was coarse thread, and that bolt got loose, and this interior part here, the spacer inside there, was moving around, and turns out that was what my problem was. The bushings really weren't that bad, but this thing was pivoting back and forth. It was loose on the bottom side, and you could see where the hole was elongated in the piece. So this is the old one, and you can see where this hole has been elongated actually on the top. The bottom one looks bad, but the one that's oblong now is the one on the top here. And so when it was in there, it was on the bottom, and what would happen would be that it would rock back and forth in there just enough to where it would change the direction of the axle that you could feel it in turns. And so I'm really glad that I'm doing this because you can't leave that alone. So the one that got loose was the one that was the coarse thread. So you don't want to do that. So I got new ones and I paint them up just like I'm doing everything else to put in there. These are the spacers that go inside the bushings on the ends that attach to the coach. On the ends that attach to the axle, most of them, it is just a 2-nut a two bolt kind of thing that goes into a threaded hole, and you need to make sure that those are also lubricated with Never Seize so you can get them off, and then lock them in with the locking tabs. So as I said, on this side, you would lower the don't let the sway bar hang, because it'll ruin the sway bar links if you do. Keep it attached like this, but disconnected. I mean, not disconnected, but loose. And that'll give you enough room to take this whole plate off, this whole assembly off, slide the backside of the rod to the inside of the bus, and the front will pop off on the axle side. Okay, so some more tips. When you're putting these together, the way I found is the easiest is to get it set up, have everything be loose, nothing even snugged up at that point. Start with the one that's, that's fixed, not the one that is on the bracket that slides. And you have to be certain that you get an equal amount of space of rubber on either side, equal or really close to equal. If this is not centered on here and the steel parts are rubbing against each other, you haven't done it properly, and it'll cause premature failure. So as you go along, you'll have to center the axle. Sometimes you have to pry it with a screwdriver. But what I found is the easiest thing to do. It's easiest to do it on the part that's attached to the axle here, and allow this part to slide back and forth. So these big bolts wouldn't be tightened. And then as you do that, you can easily center that part. And then when you get back here to do this, the whole assembly slides back and forth, on this attaching point, and you can center this part as you go, and in the end it'll come out straight. It's much easier to do it that way. And to have to tighten the bolts all the way, you'll feel them bottom out. They'll be hard to turn, but they will go all the way in, and that bushing has to be compressed like that and squeezing out. And use the black rubber rather than the yellow or the blue or whatever they have these days. I tried those two-piece nylon bushings, and I didn't have any luck with them. They were too big for this assembly, and they would squeeze out like a balloon on places, and then surprisingly, when you loosen up, it would go back to its original form. I don't know how that thing can do that much, but it did, and I found them to be just not usable. The other tip is the coach must be at the exact ride height, because these are preloaded. They don't slide anywhere in this assembly. The rubber itself twists within the rubber, sort of like a torsion suspension, rubber torsion suspension they used to have on Eagles. But it must be fixed in here and fixed out on the outer edges. And to achieve that, you have to have it tightened down all the way so that it's not actually rubbing back and forth inside there. And I think that's probably it for tips. Make sure the Never Seize that you use on there doesn't get on the rubber bushing or any other kind of grease on there. So you want to use Never Seize, but you want to be careful about where you get it. One thing I think I forgot to mention was do one rod at a time. When you take one rod off, the position of the axle will change naturally, but to get it so that you can get your bolts aligned without killing yourself, the easiest way to do that is, in this case, if you wanted to pull, if it was to shift it back, you wanted to pull it forward, you would put a jack on the rear end of this support tower here. If you wanted to pull it forward, you put a jack on the front end, the support tower, and it'll pull it forward. That way, just a small jack. You don't have to use the big jack to do that, because you're not going to put any weight on it. All you're trying to do is shift the alignment back and forth of the rods, and they will move when you take them off, so you might have to do that to make it a little easier for yourself. Otherwise, you'll be killing yourself trying to pry that thing in there, and you'll never do it. So a couple of notes about the tools that I'm using. I mentioned that I think I mentioned that I had this fairly newly purchased half-inch drive, 1,200 foot-pound impact wrench from DeWalt, 20 volts. It's an XR model, and it's 1,200 foot-pounds removing with reverse, and I think it's 1,100 foot-pounds on the highest setting on putting nuts and bolts on. But it is really a back-breaking saver on this job, because otherwise you're doing everything with hand tools. I used to use this 3/4 inch drive ratchet and extension, and I had a pipe that I put on that, and I'm telling you, you're working yourself to death on a lot of these things where you just put this impact wrench on there, this DeWalt, and it just zips them right off. And so it will take the tires on and off the bus, although I torque them when I put them on. Generally I don't have to tighten them up anymore, but it is a heck of a tool. So it has a half-inch drive, and then I step it up with these adapters to 1 inch, which is what I used to use with my big pneumatic one that I take the tires off. That's probably weighs 30 pounds or something, and it's too big to get into these spots in here. So as I said, you take off this bracket that holds the sway bar in place and also connects the radius rods on the back of the bottom of the axle. There are 2 on the top that are in there, and they're actually easier to get off. Even though it's dirty and it's hard to get to, they're easier to get off than these are, because you don't have to wiggle them around. They just take them off, take the bolts off and slide them off. On this side, just so you can see, what you do is, if you can see the painted lug up there that the front of the rod goes on, that's on the bottom of the airbag support, you slide the rod in to put it back in. You slide it in from the front back here, bring it over to the right, and kind of wedge it in there, and then slide it onto that lug first. Once you get that in place, then you can reassemble your bracket here and put that all together. And don't tighten anything up until you get it all lined up. Keep everything loose, and begin by putting the one on that's on the axle first, and making sure you get it centered. So those are some of the tips. Once you get that in place, you keep this sliding. This whole bracket assembly will slide back and forth. Keep that sliding. And another tip is to help you line them up so they're evenly spaced. Put the back of the rod evenly spaced in this bracket, and it'll help you get it lined up when you're doing it. When you go to put the round plates back on the front part of the bar next to the axle, be sure you use one of these locking tabs. You can get them from Luke, and you bend them over to make sure you hold the bolts in place. Otherwise, these bolts will back out. So you want to be careful when you do that, to make sure you use these locking tabs.